News. Let's start, as usual, by discussing the general information about the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Yes.
It should be noted that the Ukrainian Defense Forces have achieved tactical successes in the Pokrovsk direction, particularly in Pokrovsk itself. Let me remind you that by decision of the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, Syrsky, additional units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces were redeployed to Pokrovsk. An additional unit of UAV drone operators, as well as Special Forces units, the main intelligence directorate, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and other components of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. It was precisely this that made it possible to significantly stabilize the situation in this industrial center. We are talking about the fact that the Ukrainian Defense Forces managed to break through almost to the center of Pokrovsk and raise the Ukrainian flag, over the buildings of these administrative structures. It should be noted that over the past day, special units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces have eliminated more than 100. This figure only accounts for irrecoverable losses, not including so-called sanitary losses. At the moment, the main efforts of the special units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Special Operations Forces are focused on unblocking the logistics of the Ukrainian Defense Forces and expanding the area of presence in order to prevent the possible operational encirclement of our units. Currently, fierce fighting is taking place in the area of the so-called industrial zone, or Promka. The occupiers are attempting to operate with small assault groups in order to infiltrate urban areas and thereby create the threat of operational encirclement directly within the city itself. In addition, it should be noted that the occupiers are widely using cabs against the ECH. Accordingly, these strikes target both the temporary deployment points of Ukrainian Defense Forces personnel and primarily the residential areas of Pokrovsk. Moreover, indiscriminate strikes are being used which are in principle prohibited by all international conventions, including those ratified by the occupying country itself. And let me remind you, according to various estimates, there are between 1,500 to 2,000 local residents in Pokrovsk. In other words, the local population has effectively become hostages to this barbaric tactic employed by the Russian occupiers. And there is some good news regarding the flanks of the Pokrovsk direction. The occupiers have not succeeded in closing the operational encirclement of Ukrainian troops in the area of Mirnorod, despite the fact that special units of the occupying country's army have been deployed to this area. In addition, there is already verified information about the redeployment of additional units of Russian occupation forces and accordingly additional strike assets to this area. First and foremost, we're talking about thermobaric weapon systems. These are the TOS-1A Solntsepyok and the TOS-2 Tosochka. And also, now on to the positive developments. These are the tactical successes of the Ukrainian Defense Forces in the areas of Shakhov and Rodinske. These two settlements are key for ensuring the logistics of the Ukrainian Defense Forces at this moment. And our defenders have managed to significantly improve their positions in these directions. Moreover, there has been significant progress in the area of Shakhov. This effectively allows us to cut off the so-called incursion of Russian troops into the defense lines of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. In other words, the situation is difficult, but I want to emphasize once again that it is far from the assessments being voiced both in Western media and accordingly in Russian media regarding a critical situation. And most importantly, the information that Pokrovsk might fall in within the next week, which is being widely reported in Western media, is absolutely not true. Dmitry.
Because of Pokrovsk, of course, most of the attention is focused on this particular section of the front, but we are somewhat forgetting about the others. What is happening in Kupiansk right now? Just a week ago, the General Staff said that Ukraine's defense forces were having significant success there. In other words, those who had infiltrated have already been sufficiently. They are being effectively driven out of the city limits. According to your information, what is happening in Kupiansk now? In the
Kupiansk direction, the situation has been largely stabilized. Moreover, I would note that the further advance of the Russian occupiers toward the key railway junction Kupiansk-Vuzlovyi has effectively been stopped. This was, in fact, the main objective of the Russian occupiers' offensive. The capture of this key railway junction was intended to improve their logistics. Thanks to the short supply route from the territory of the Russian Federation and the occupied areas of Luhansk region. At the moment, fighting is ongoing in the areas of Petropavlivka, Pechan, and Hlushkivka. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have managed to significantly slow the advance of the occupying troops even within Kupiansk itself. In other words, there is no significant control over the settlement by the occupying forces. Operational reserves have been redeployed to this direction, and accordingly, the Russian occupiers, lacking the ability to replenish their personnel, let me remind you, the natural barrier of the Oskil River prevents the occupiers from transferring the necessary amount of equipment and accordingly personnel for further advancement. So these factors are precisely what allow the Ukrainian Defense Forces to significantly stabilize the situation in this direction.
It is also worth discussing with you that the information about the Russian occupiers capturing settlements in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions does not correspond to reality. This was reported by the spokesperson for the Southern Defense Forces, Vladislav Voloshin. He noted that the situation in the Oleksandrivka, Huliaipole, and Orikhiv directions is actually difficult. There have been nearly 50 combat clashes there in the past 24 hours. And Voloshin added that fierce fighting is still ongoing in the Pavlivka area. One of the Ukrainian brigades is holding the defense. Battles are also taking place in the Plavny area, where the so-called gray zone remains. Well, once again, another piece of Russian propaganda is being spread about the capture of territory, which does not correspond to reality. How difficult is the situation there really? And what is the actual dynamic on these particular sections of the front?
It should be noted that, unfortunately, it's not only Russian media spreading this, but so-called Ukrainian analysts also periodically disseminate information that does not correspond to reality. Here, accordingly, the National Security and Defense Council, NSDC, needs to raise the issue of the activities of so-called analysts in the Ukrainian information space. I would note that this information is precisely what is being used by Russian special services to conduct information and psychological operations, IPESO. That is, references are made to this analytical center and, accordingly, information about the tactical successes of the Russian occupiers is then further promoted. I would note that we have repeatedly refuted the reports from this so-called analytical center about the tactical successes of the Russian occupiers on your broadcast. There has been a widespread rebuttal from the Ukrainian Defense Forces and accordingly from other relevant entities. Specifically the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine and accordingly the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. All of this provides grounds to raise the question, I want to emphasize again, about the presence of such reports from this analytical center in the Ukrainian information space. Now, as for the battles themselves, it should be noted that the occupiers are trying to expand their presence in the area of the settlement of Primorska. Moreover, they are trying to use the dried-up Kakhovka reservoir, which currently has dense vegetation. In other words, they are trying to use the terrain for flanking attacks on the positions of Ukraine's defense forces. The main objective of the occupiers is to get close enough to Zaporizhzhia to establish direct fire contact, using tube artillery, that is, within 10 to 15 kilometers. That is why it is no coincidence that the main attacks are concentrated in the area of Primorsk and accordingly Plavny. Let me emphasize once again, in the Plavny area a gray zone is being maintained, so all reports of tactical successes by the occupiers do not correspond to reality. Moreover, the occupiers have been forced to admit, even at the official level, as seen in statements by Rogozin, the former head of Roscosmos, the tactical successes of Ukraine's defense forces in this direction. Moreover, the occupiers have been forced to acknowledge the superiority of Ukraine's defense forces in the use of FPV drones, which prevent them from carrying out attacks of this nature and furthermore from redeploying personnel and equipment. According to Rogozhin's own admission, up to 4 FPV drones can be used by both the Russian occupation army and Ukraine's defense forces against a single target, that is, a serviceman. The Russian Federation cannot afford to do the same. This points to significant achievements by the Ukrainian defense industry in scaling up drone production, and accordingly to the widespread use of these strike assets by Ukraine's defense forces, which allows them to minimize the occupiers' advantages, both in equipment and in manpower.
Dmitry, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your comments.